Hello everybody, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by RSI Content Solutions and DCL, entitled Truth About Do-It-Yourself CMS and Content Conversion. This webinar was prepared by Pat Sabosik from Elm City Consulting, and I just want to take this opportunity to thank you all for spending this hour with us. My name is Sarah Silveri, and I am the Inside Sales Representative at RSI Content Solutions, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Just to go through a little housekeeping before we kick the webinar off today. Number one, today's webinar is being recorded, and you will receive the email with a link to this recording. I believe it's going to be coming either today or tomorrow, so you will receive that email. And please feel free to share that link with whomever you'd like. The more the merrier. And just a second thing, we'll reserve about 15 minutes at the end of today's webinar to answer any questions you may have. So please submit any questions or comments to the right and at any point during the webinar, and we will answer them at the end. Next slide, please. And now for some background on our companies. DCL stands for Data Conversion Laboratory. DCL is a leader in organizing, converting, and moving content to modern formats for wide access and new revenue streams. With expertise across many industries, DCL's proprietary technology, matched with its US-based project management teams, solves clients' complex conversion challenges securely, accurately, and on time. DCL started in 1981 and continues to, quote, future-proof, unquote, content for government, publishers, nonprofits, and a variety of other verticals. Next slide, please. Our Suite CMS is an enterprise content management system designed specifically for publishers and media organizations. Our Suite CMS is used to store, manage, edit, and deliver content. In 2006, the first version of our Suite CMS was released. Today, our Suite CMS serves a number of publishing verticals, including STM, educational, scholarly, legal, and many more. Some of the world's leading publishers use our suite, manage and deliver content to any place, at any time, and in any format. Our Suite CMS helps publishers meet new revenue opportunities quickly and affordably. And now I'd like to introduce Pat Sabosik from Elm City Consulting. Pat is an informational industry executive with much expertise launching digital businesses and building new brands for Fortune 1000 companies. Pat?
Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you all for spending the rest of the hour with us. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on my company, just to let you know that our work, and I have a small management consulting firm, is really at the intersection of information technology and applications. We can see that on the slide. I have a lot of experience in corporate planning and strategy, and I help my clients with either their content strategy, their digital product strategy, fold-in acquisitions, and also looking at ROI analysis and how we can operationalize solutions for new information products and providers. So with that background, I'm going to jump into do-it-yourself versus do-it-with experts. And that really is the crux of our presentation. There's a certain time and place for using internal IT resources for good use, and there's also a time for using external vendors. And the takeaway from this particular slide is that there's a request for proposal process, the RFP process, vendor selection, and vendor management really are the new important functions for internal IT resources. And there's a shift from we can do everything ourselves to doing work externally with partners. The vendor management of the content stack is really in a partnership of content conversion and content management and integration. And here's a list, not on the slide, but I'll tell you of some of the key integration points that are adding to complexity, but also moving us into a much more of a digital publishing and digital provision scenario. There's the content itself, the content converted to a digital format, richly tagged, managing the content internally for product development, application of taxonomies, the integration of a search engine, the distribution of web content management, particularly with rich media, delivery platforms, and storage. So the additional takeaway is aligning company goals and content expertise are important IT investments. The next slide is do-it-yourself versus external suppliers. Really the next step in the presentation we'll look at and we'll go into some depth on these three concepts: life cycles, evolution, and ROI. So when we think about life cycles, there's a huge amount of digital content that's available today. When we talk about 2011, the digital universe reaches 1.2 zettabytes of data. Zettabyte is 10 to the 21st power, so that's a huge amount of data. Some of that is the increase is being driven by consumers and the use of the web, particularly images, Twitter, Pinterest, Facebook, are websites that are pushing the boundaries on YouTube, on digital and imaging, but it's also being driven by professional publishers and information providers as the demand for images, video, and data sets are integrated into various platforms and devices. So we see that software, product, and content development life cycles are more closely aligned to drive investment levels. I want to take a minute here to also talk about when we have these rich data sources, there is the issue of how do we find things and how do we discover things. We're going to go into this in a little bit more detail later on, but I wanted to take a minute and just describe a little bit about findability, how we find our content through search engines, term mapping, and increasing the amount of metadata around a content item or a content object so that our content can be search engine optimized. Findability is term matching. Discoverability is the addition of semantic terms and taxonomies to be able to find things that are more like this, concepts that are similar but may not have specific terms in the document itself. Faceted search and taxonomies are good examples of discoverability. Faceted searches are classification systems that filter down in a predetermined taxonomy order until you narrow your list to find the thing you absolutely want. Good examples are in retail. You can narrow your search to find a book or to find a piece of music. In the scientific world, you can narrow your search down to find a particular gene or a particular chemical structure by moving through a taxonomic structure. You can find things that are more like this without having the term in place. For example, I could be reading an article about iPads, but I could discover in my search articles that just talk about tablet use without having the term Apple or iPad in there. So as we begin to think about these particular concepts, we'll see these interspersed in my presentation. My next slide looks at the alignment of life cycles, and we begin to see that, we're seeing it today. There's a clear alignment between software development life cycles, the product development, and content development life cycles. So really the takeaway here is that there is a maturity in content development and the content development life cycle that aligns itself with the already established processes and paths for and decision steps for the other two life cycles so that content can be managed, new content can be put into the stream, old content can be retired. We see the life cycle staging, as I mentioned, and development has matured. We see the alignment. There's also a huge trend in information companies now integrating the application life cycle management into this particular mix, and to the extent that content and the use of content is pushed through applications, we see a further alignment of content, product, and software development. IDC recently had a study that indicates organizations taking a new end-to-end approach to all of their life cycle management. The next slide looks at evolution, and we see that there's a challenge of keeping up with the life cycles and the increasing complexity of content management. So I'm going to look at four stages in the evolution. There's the content conversion itself, content enhancement, content augmentation, and content rendering. I'm going to pause here for a minute. Okay. I'm going to repeat this because I think we were off on the audio. There's content conversion, content enhancement, content augmentation, and content rendering. The important factors driving the evolution of content use, of this whole product evolution, is the amount of content available, search engine enhancements and findability, the consumer web trends of immediacy of content, social and mobile use, and strong analytics designed for new products to sustain our customers and improve our profitability. I'd like to take a step here to also talk about DTDs versus DITA. Just a few words about structuring content for digital use. The DTD, or the document type definition, is a fairly well-entrenched model in the publishing industry. I think if you've been in the industry for even a short period of time, you'll see that most publishers or large information sources are using a DTD to describe their content. You can extrapolate different schema or subsets of that DTD to support different products and change the metadata around that for different uses. There is a new model, it's not that new, but there is a model that's emerging called DITA. DITA stands for Darwin Information Type Architecture. It is an OASIS standard XML data model for authoring and publishing. It's Java-based. And if you can search this on Wikipedia if you're not that familiar with it, DITA it's content that's created in small topics or items rather than long book form or long chapters. And it creates a map of your content that links topics organized into a sequence which could be hierarchical, and they appear, and then you can assemble that together in a finished document. The DITA map defines the table of contents for deliverables, and there's a relationship table in DITA maps that can specify how topics are linked to each other. Not that dissimilar from using schema to pull up into a document type. DITA has been used actually very successfully for technical manual publishing, where pieces are moved around interchangeably, and we're beginning to see some successes in general publishing. I just wanted to mention that because there is, as your content is tagged and converted, it can be tagged into many different formats, and so this is, DTD is of course the established one in publishing, but there may be others that are tagged also for XML distribution. The next slide takes these four concepts and puts them together in a way that shows the relationships between them, and also it shows the cost and the complexity necessary to meet new user demands. We see the interplay here of content and function. And what I like about this model is its flexibility. I can keep the same functions, conversion, enhancement, augmentation, and rendering, and change the outcomes to match different product lines. For example, I could have a quadrant for news that might look different from a quadrant for a textbook or for a scientific article, but they can follow the same stages, and the stages can be used for process, partner selection, budgeting, and revenue return as we go around that circle. And underpinning all of those, as we think about XML as one of the building blocks for our industry, we also see that analytics and predictive analytics are also becoming building blocks for making decisions on our next generation of products and services. I'm going to look at each one of those quadrants separately and give you some examples along the way. So when we think about content conversion, which is the next slide, we're shifting to digital first. And that really is a change from having digital be a byproduct of print. It's changing processes, internal processes, and also changing the economics of the business. The conversion is present at all stages of content evolution, and conversion and tagging to output XML, again, are our building blocks. In this diagram, it's an educational product. One of the outputs actually is a DITA map. You can't see that, but there's a little book on the bottom that says DITA on it, which means that it's really a subset of possibly of a textbook. Content conversion can cover or include DTDs as well as DITA, and schemas are used to identify legacy content. They can also, these schemas can also be used to retag legacy content, and the retagged content can be used in new products or new uses. An example is taking a look at rich media and rich media tagging, where the metadata around a picture, an image, a table, a map can be extrapolated and identified outside of a printed product or a PDF. Particularly in higher ed, pulling together a collection of images around a particular concept like geography, pulling all the maps in a collection together to create a story can be an interesting way of navigating a set of astronomy textbooks or geography textbooks. I'm going to use geography because I'm going to give another example using geocodes, where we can add codes to content and create and actually create new paths for navigation and new products. So our takeaway from this slide is that content conversion is becoming more complex as demands for digital content and uses of digital content increases. Our next slide is content enhancement. And here we see digital asset management has a focus on, I'm just going to borrow from that last slide when we talk about rich media as digital asset management. And we focus on pictures, images, and video. The consumer web is driving that content growth. However, the scientific web is increasing its content footprint with more digital images, more data sets, more taxonomies, and the incorporation of linked data, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation on the slide on content augmentation, when we look at relationships between content. And of course, scientific discipline lends itself to relationships. If we think about granularity, we look at the basics, for example, math ML. And I'll give you an example of when we get into the granularity of this. One of my clients was using math ML on their mathematical formulas. They were using it actually inconsistently. Some products had it, some products didn't. Their math formulas were just images embedded in a page. When they began to look at ways to pull all of their math formulas together to create either a new product or a toolkit for their students so that they could provide that as a learning tool across a whole range of math books, they were not able to do that because they had inconsistent tagging and inconsistent conversion. So all of those older gifts needed to be extrapolated, retagged, and put back into the content management system, which was additional time and money that if they had done all the tagging consistently in the first place, they would have had a resource that they could have pulled out and reused. So consider this when selecting vendors. If you're using more than one, and a lot of the large global publishers do use more than one content conversion house, ensure that consistency and quality of tagging are in place. For example, all authors and co-authors are tagged the same way. All metadata about an article is in the same place and uses the same terms. And geocodes, which we'll talk about next, are added consistently or are mapped to consistently if you're mapping in after the fact. Legacy content that has new relevance is tagged consistently. For example, converting legacy PDF content to XML for searching and distribution and packaging and new products needs to be consistent. The next slide I'm going to go through, just talk about is the geocoding. And this is a very simple but quite powerful example of using content for both reuse and visualization. This example came from Springer. They have an application on the web called author mapping. I think it's a simple and elegant use of both geocodes, where you take essentially a location, an address, which is an institution, a city, a state, a country. You can map all those things together by just putting a few quadrants together and map it to the author, and then you place it on a map. So now you're visualizing where the author's institutions are. Data can be married with research expertise to show centers of excellence around the world. This particular application has an author widget that can be used by other publishers, but I think it's just a great example of showing how a use for location. There are other open source projects around the world where researchers, anthropologists can put in their research data, and you can see a map of where there are archaeological or anthropological sites around the world where research is being done. And that's just one way of looking at geocoding. The next slide comes from an EDUCAUSE article sponsored by Adobe, and this is a good slide for the higher ed group, where it shows for educational publishers the evolution of content trends from static content to more granular and dynamic content. And the underpinnings of this, of course, are consistently and expertly tagged XML, smart tagging, so that we have flexible management. We see that the next generation of content is granular and adaptive. There are open standards and interoperability, and really the plus here is the interoperability of content between the publisher systems, the campus systems, and the student devices and student engagement, being able to do that through more dynamic content. So there's revenue implications for this, particularly for educational content. Very exciting time for the higher ed community. My next slide is content augmentation. And in this concept, we're adding to basic content to make it more usable, increase findability and discoverability in search engines with the addition of semantic tagging and the use of taxonomies, particularly faceted searches and discipline-specific taxonomies. Tagging entities or entity extraction and then tagging them with the chemical names, particularly in the STM industry. Drug names, disease names enables an STM publisher to extract indexes of terms and data sets that become content themselves and create new ways of navigating the scientific literature or the educational literature. An example of the educational literature is adding difficulty level to higher ed information products. Difficulty level Bloom's taxonomies, and then pulling out those subsets into more granular pieces so that students can learn at their own level and move up or down the level as the difficulty challenges present themselves. The next slide I'm going to talk about is taxonomies and taxonomy codes. We find that there are taxonomies that are industry-specific or content-specific, and some that are very general. Just hold on one second for me. Okay. In this particular example, we see a piece of content that has the terms identified for extraction, where we're, in this example, I apologize, there's names authorities, there can be location authorities, company names, product names. These are general examples of taxonomy. Or specific examples, agriculture, chemistry, business, news, telecom, and healthcare, where the taxonomy helps make the content relevant to users searching for content. For example, Apple is a company, Apple is a fruit, Apple is a product. So we can think about those things. An example that comes out of taxonomies and entity extraction. Or example of use here is linked data, and that's an emerging trend in content management. And it's driven by the semantic web, where we're beginning to see some commercial applications of that to create relationships between sets of content. It's available. It's emerging because not only we have large data sets, but because we can begin to build these relationships through metadata, XML-based metadata. There is the underpinnings of linked data is the resource description framework, RDF, and it's a metadata model that lays the foundation to build relationships about resources or content elements. One use of the linked data is a concept called triples, where there's a subject-predicate-object relationship that can be pulled from tagged content. An example is drug A cures disease B. And so here we see a partnership of tagged content, rich metadata, a search engine, web presentation, and visualization. Nature's website has some examples of linked data. MarkLogic is doing a lot of work in this area as well, and these are all based on digital content, XML, granular tagging, and enhanced content. The two companies who are sponsoring this webinar series, RSI and DCL, are also doing work in this particular area with resource description framework. I'm not endorsing any particular company. I'm just saying that these are trends that are on the forefront of content management and content conversion, and I think we all should be paying attention to them because they're going to affect our industry going forward. The next slide shows some examples of linked data. And here we see relationships that are made between concepts and clusters of information where we have the different relationships. We can drill down through these network maps to find specific sources or actually to see particular items, or we can look at it at this roll-up level. This is not that easy to see, but you can find these things on the web. The one on the left is an example from, I think it's an IBM site. And it's all open source. We can see that there is a relationship between a number of, in your slide here, the pink areas are life sciences publications or life sciences websites and how they're particularly linked together through concepts. And the green ones up on top are cross-domain, and we see the Association for Computing Machinery and a number of other open source sites that have information on either digitization or computerization or linking things together. So that's a rich example. The example on the right is Nature Publishing. It's a developer site showing you how you actually can link your data together. And I think we're going to see more of these maps emerge as we can begin to look at them as new navigation schemes for our content. The next slide is on content rendering. So we've gone around the block here to the rendering side of things, which is what happens at the end. How do I present my content in a way that's usable to people who are consuming it? So one common example is eBooks, where we see the Kindle, the iPad, the Nook, there's PDFs, there's others. And rendering applications will be as good as the content is tagged and managed for push and chunked for syndication. So we'll take a minute to look at eBooks, where we have a format, EPUB format, which is vendor-independent XML, and it's the most widely used vendor format by Apple. The Apple iOS for iBook uses the EPUB format. So does BlackBerry for their Playbook, Barnes & Noble for their Nook, Sony Reader, and the Mobi Pocket is, while it's its own standard for output, is also has some of their newer applications based on the EPUB format. But not everybody's using EPUB. Microsoft has a format. There's a comic book format. Sony has one for broadband eBooks, and Amazon Kindle is using the KF8 format, which is completely different. But I think as we think about these different rendering things, particularly for eBooks, we'll see a convergence of standards and display as this particular industry matures. I think it will be driven by the ebook readers and tablets particularly. Mobile apps and activities like search and educational quizzes, chemical names and lookups, those all are emerging as well. But in addition to the mobile apps, we see advertising as a way to both create my view, a personalization of things, and then also to be able to push advertising associated with a particular piece of content or a particular personal view, and that's another revenue opportunity that's emerging. Just a few billion in numbers over the last 2 years, but it will be increasing over time. My next slide is looking at ROI and profitability, and particularly operating efficiency. So we'll look at, on the ROI, we'll look at operating efficiencies first. What can I save? And then I'll follow this with a slide on where can I make new money. In the operating efficiencies, I mean, the 3 big areas are content conversion, content management, and enriching the content for reuse. I have a couple of examples here, but one is a client example who modified a CMS system for a particular use for one segment of their business. And then they modified it again for another segment. And then they modified it again for a particular product line. So that at the end of a few years, there were at least a dozen versions of the original CMS they had, managing a variety of content. And the inconsistency actually began to cost them more money in keeping up all those versions than it would keeping one version consistent with the use that it needed across a line of products. So in this particular area, looking at operating efficiencies, a really eye-opener for me was this particular website, cmsmatrix.org, where there's over 1,200 content management systems available. Many of them are commercial, some large providers, small providers, and then there's a bunch of them that are bespoke. There's a few that are open source. Actually, there's a lot that are open source. But what we see is that there's a proliferation of do-it-yourself systems and smaller systems, and that in itself creates inefficiencies in the sense that it requires more decision-making, more decision time to decide which one is the right one for you, and that working with experts can help you cut down that decision time a lot. And it's an interesting site to go and take a look at. Another example in operating efficiencies is actually reducing staff time. So when I think about formulas for ROI and some of the work that I've done with clients, I look at what's my content investment, what's the software, what's the platform, what's the throughput, am I saving any processing time, am I saving any staff time, and that usually is where the area is a large area, and then can that drive more revenue? The Aberdeen group did a really good study last year on XML hierarchical data integration, and the business benefits that they saw coming out of XML data is increases my time for information, that equals new sale. It increases the time to decision making, that's increasing my cash flow, and it's increasing my time to integrate new data sources, which means my product extension and my product library then can be richer because I can do things much more quickly. So thinking about operating efficiencies is aligning your work with vendors who are right for you and that have the right interoperability with your content stack and can deliver things that are aligned with your company goals. The next slide is ROI and profitability, new revenue streams. So we have some examples here are looking at bibliographic data and geocodes, and we can actually create new products. And that author mapping is one example. We can look at research centers of excellence. We can look at author relationships with co-authors who are not in the same institution and see where those mapping relationships are. We can look at, as ProQuest and Elsevier and a number of other publishers are looking at funding sources. Where are the sources going? What's the funding agency? Where are they? Where is their money going, and what's it going for? And you can begin to build relationships between investment, the funding, the person, the source, not the source, the object, which is what are they funding? Is it cancer research, and what kind of cancer research, heart research, et cetera, and where are those centers of excellence? We also see the triples in the STMS content, new combinations of index content where you can actually create an index of all the diseases that are cured by drug A or drug B, or what's the relationship between these drugs and these diseases. Once you map those things together, you have a completely different product and a different way of navigating around your content. So thinking about this is looking at vendors that you should select for their expertise. Their job is to stay on top of technology and trends so they can help their publishing clients leverage that expertise for the publisher's core business. Select vendors that have the right content expertise, develop a flexible contract, that's also important, and spend time building and managing the relationship. Some of these great ideas are actually coming from both the internal publishing staff and the internal IT staff. Developing a proof of concept and productizing them then becomes a good activity of the publisher themselves and the vendor. And remember that we mentioned in the beginning, vendor management is an important skill in both the IT and publishing functions. And the three items when we think about vendor management that we're going to that affect this ROI, particularly here in new revenue, is the software and tools, the staff time, change handling. But what are the new revenue possibilities? Can we monetize author maps? Possibly. Can we monetize author maps indirectly by using it as a retention tool for authors if I'm in an STMS publishing house? So there are different ways of thinking about how I monetize something, and it may be offering content or a subscription to some of these indexes independently of the actual core text themselves. So in summary, we're looking at content management and XML. I'll just read a little bit from this slide because I think it's really important, that really are the building blocks for the next generation of content. We're relying much, much more on XML than I think we did in the last 5 years. And vendor selection and alignment, particularly as we think about those product life cycles and what's your company's overall corporate strategy, and how are you going to use your IT resources when it comes to content conversion and content management. And how can you use your expert partners to improve your ROI? And my next slide is, thank you very much, and I'm going to turn this back over to Sarah to see if we have any questions that have come from the audience.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Pat. That was really great. Well, everybody, before we jump into questions, I just wanted to quickly ask you all to take 2 quick surveys after the webinar, so you don't have to rush to do it right now. We've made it easy for you to do the first survey. It's going to pop up right after the webinar ends, so you just take it right there. And the second survey is basically for us to get an idea of where you all stand in regards to publishing. URL is on the screen right now, rsicms.com and /pub survey. So if you could take that, they both take about 5 minutes, so we greatly appreciate that. Thank you in advance. All right, so a few questions. We have some really great ones, so thank you all for your participation. The first one, this is directed, obviously, at Pat. What is the difference between findability and discoverability?
Okay, great. I talked about that a little bit in the beginning or somewhere in the middle of the slide, so let me go through some of that again. Findability is tagging my content so that I can be found by a search engine. And my search results are coming up with a direct map of my term to another term. That match can be, when I search, the term could be in the content itself, which is what I hope it is, and it could certainly have a high relevance, which means it's higher up in the article, or it's repeated a lot in the article, so that there's a number of times it's repeated. Sorry, that's an awkward way of saying that there's a lot of those. The term has is in the article a lot, or it has a very high sequence. It's in the first or second paragraph, or I have added that term to the metadata of a number of content objects in my article or in my book, so that the proximity would come up. It would be, and frequency would come up. Discoverability is where I am looking for something, but I'm going to use quotes, discover something that is similar. When I mentioned more like this in the early web, you would take your search results, string all those words together, or the search engine would do it in the background, and execute your search with a different combination of terms to find things that were related to your search results. Discoverability today is actually the marriage of taxonomies with your content. So it's bringing in related terms and semantic tagging so that you can find things that are related, or you can narrow your search down so that you can then discover the item you're looking for. If it's a known or it's an unknown search. So the example I was using before is books or music. I'm looking for an author. I'm looking for a particular author. I get that. Now I want to see what their publications are, and then I want to pick one. I can also use faceted. I could also use facets to drill down in a scientific corpus to find a particular gene, and then I can search even further to find particular drugs that are associated with that gene. So I'm narrowing my search as I go down, and I'm discovering along the way relationships between content. So discoverability is the use of semantic tagging, faceted taxonomies, which are much more structured than just a general taxonomy, although they can branch into different fields. And then how that's applied to the content so that you can see things that are related. I gave a simple example of Apple, but there's also, the legal profession uses discoverability a lot for lawyers in Westlaw or LexisNexis who are searching for a case. They could be looking for a particular case, but their search engines will present to them cases that are similar, either based on the verdict or on the characteristics of the case. Is it a murder? Is it personal injury? So they can show you other things that are related while they may not be specifically aligned to your particular case. So those are two good examples. And there is a big trend on improving findability, particularly for SEO and for advertisers. How can I get my stuff matched, if I'm an advertiser, to terms that are closely related to me? But there's also discoverability. How can I, if my advertising is as targeted as it can be, what about unrelated advertising? Can I spend a little money to be discovered in related items or related terms? Like, can I advertise in all the tablet webs, all the technology sites that are looking at tablets if I'm Apple? Well, maybe not, but maybe if I'm a new entrant, I would want to look at something a little bit more general. So that's more of the discoverability. The networked information that we began to show before in that linked data, using the RDF XML metadata, is really another way to discover relationships between content. That's what the legal profession is using, and the scientific profession is moving in that direction as well. So I think those are the two good ways of describing the difference between findability and discoverability.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. All right, so the next question is, I really feel this question is very helpful. We've all had to ask bosses to come down to our level and get where we're coming from. So do you have any recommended approaches to discussing content management strategies with executives?
That is a really, really good question. And one approach that I've taken with clients before, and I think we can get close to answering that question, is executives know success. Actually, everybody loves success, and senior managers love success as well because it gives them a model. So one approach to looking at content management, which is a little bit more granular in an organization, is to look at how you would where are their successes in operating efficiencies that has come before content management. So bringing in the life cycle concept, I think, is a good one because it shows that you've got examples in technology where the life cycles have matured, investment levels can be managed, investment levels can be mapped to new products, and ROI formulas are very explicit. So we can say, I need a new data warehouse. This is how the IT organization and the life cycle of the IT warehouse will be. This is the amount of content going in, the amount of content coming out. This is what I'm using it for. This is how it helps my business. And so you've got all those metrics in place. In the product life cycle, we're beginning to see more of that maturity as well. So there's a fine timeline. You can put time on each one of those steps, costs and revenue, map revenue to all those and say, well, my product life cycle is a year, or it could be 3 years. And if it's a piece of software, then I can depreciate it over a certain period of time. Content is beginning to look the same way. And so aligning a content life cycle with how many steps in the decision making, what are the investment levels along each path, and how does that support essentially the product life cycle or the advertising life cycle that you've got in the company, with an investment level approach and an operational efficiency approach, I think, is a good way to go.
All right, thank you very much. All right, so our last question is, from a cultural perspective, what are some of the ways you have seen organizations successfully transition from print-centric to content-centric processes?
Oh, the shift from print to digital.
Okay.
Well, let me take that.
Yeah, sure, yes. I mean, answer it as best you can.
Okay. So if we're thinking of the cultural perspective, if I'm let me give you a couple of examples. If I'm a large global publisher, I have an investment in both print and digital. But up until a few years ago, most of my revenue was coming from print, and a smaller percentage of my revenue was coming from digital. How I make that shift, particularly if I'm a large publisher, which means in most cases I'm probably a public company, is managing my shareholder expectations, managing my revenue stream, managing my cash flow. So how do I make that investment so that I can begin to have that transition from print to digital? So there's the level of the transition, and then there's the cultural mind shift in my organization. How do I get my staff who are expert editors and are great at paper to think about things in a completely different way and look at the cultural shift of being a digital publisher as opposed to a print publisher? And that's where I think publishers today, or even information providers, are facing their biggest challenge. I did some work with a company a year or two ago who was in the process. We redesigned job descriptions. This is a little bit of a tangent off of this particular presentation, but we redesigned job descriptions to move people from an editorial position to a product manager and gave them a product line. A line of fiction books, a line of history textbooks or math textbooks, or a line of chemistry journals is not that dissimilar from a product line of chemistry journals. And once you begin to make that mental shift from I'm producing something in hard copy to I'm producing something that can have a network effect, you begin to think about things a little bit differently. And so if you're a large publisher, you're managing your investments and your stockholders. If you're a medium, so now I'm going to go down the list. If you're a medium-sized publisher, and you're looking at your shift from print to digital and your cultural perspective on making that shift, you probably can manage things a little bit better. If you're a small publisher, you can actually do that much more nimbly by having a smaller investment, but there's fewer pieces to manage. The cultural perspective really is in the job descriptions, the mindset, and the sort of the capabilities that people need to think about as they come into these new jobs and think about linked data as opposed to static data. And I'll use eBooks as an example. The publishing houses have been creating eBooks or digital versions of their products for a decade, and they are primarily in a PDF format. And now we have these additional ebook formats mapping to new devices where they can be consumed. Well, the early ebook format was fairly primitive. The PDF is an image of the page. The newer ebook formats still have a page design, but there's some other applications that that are added to that to make the reading experience a good one. One of them is being able to flip pages. The other is being able to bookmark a page. So those are pretty simple. And then if you think about the next step, well, I can highlight, and I can highlight with, say, with my finger, or I can highlight with a palette that can come up if I need to have that. Safari has used that for a number of years on the Safari website. The higher ed publishers now are incorporating highlighting in, so they're trying to mimic what's happening in the print version. But the real power comes if you can think about things a little bit differently and say, or embed into your ebook the links out to things that are related. I'm reading a book now on India. This is a true story, on my iPad, and I came across some Indian terms I didn't know. So I could highlight the term, and I have a choice that Apple's embedded into their ebook, their iOS, their iBook. I can go to the web. I can search Wikipedia. There's a couple of places I can go, and then I can come back and I can copy that URL and put a note in next to that particular term, so the next time I want to go there, I can have that. I can build a map library. I can build a library of my notes. I can build a library of my highlights, and it indexes all of that in a way that I can't do easily in print and have it be searchable and findable in the way that I can in a digital file. And that's just one example of a nonfiction book on history that's just rich with ways to link out into other resources that I can't do in a printed book. So having the mindset to be able to think that way will be driving the next generation of publisher. So there's an investment. I'm just going to go back again. We talk about the investment in the systems. There's also investment in people. And that really moves us down to the question you asked before that, is how do you talk to executives about about content management systems? There's probably two conversations. One is how you operationalize that so that there's an investment level and you can align it to the different life cycles. But the second is there's an investment in people, and how do you essentially, if you're going to retool your content, how do you retool your staff to be able to do this as well, so that the skills that somebody has acquired over a lifetime can be repurposed in this online environment? Because editors think this way all the time. They just don't have the tools to be able to actually manifest it. And I think having these XML building blocks and tagged content enable them to do things that they have only dreamt of in paper.
All right. Well, thank you all so very much for attending our webinar. Thank you so much, Pat. I really appreciate your wonderful presentation. And hopefully you've seen you guys have seen the link that I posted in the chat section. So you can click on that for our other survey. And the first survey should pop up right after the webinar ends. So thank you all so very much for taking this time, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much.